and welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya. Brazil's new president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, visited the United States President Joe Biden in their White House on Friday. The joint statement talks about mitigating climate change and defending human rights. And we look today at Brazil on the world stage. Next up, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida met in Tokyo on Thursday. They spoke of accelerating defense cooperation, a focus that's cause for growing alarm in the region. And we have an update on the hot air around China's weather balloon the United States recently shot down. Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was in the United States, and it's safe to assume he and Joe Biden discussed more than rainforests. The backdrop of the visit is the divergent positions on the Ukraine war. And right-wing former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro is in the United States, and there's much talk about his extradition and the charges at home. Marco Fernandes from Dongxing News joins us to discuss Brazil's strategy on the world stage. Marco, thanks for joining us. Marco, a very crucial visit in the United States, Brazil trying to get on the world stage, important on many levels. But we cannot ignore the last 10 years of the US role in Brazil either. Can you talk about what is the strategy here?
Hello, Pragya. Nice to be here. Well, I mean, you're right. Definitely, Brazil is back to the main stage of the global geopolitics, and I think this visit for Biden is one of the chapters. Lula has been doing like intense a round of meetings with leaders from all over the world. Yeah, I would say you said about 10 years. Disruptive role in Brazil or something like this. I would say it's decades. It's actually the whole history, I think, of Brazil and the whole Latin America it's about the role, the bad influence of US. I think for now, first of all, I think it was this visit was a very low profile visit. The conversations last only for 2 hours. There was no like big announcements. Actually, the only like concrete thing is that US agreed to join the so-called the Amazon Fund, which is supposed to fund initiatives to keep the rainforest alive. But to be honest, it was a little bit of embarrassing because they said they would offer maybe $50 million, which is actually not a big amount of money for US. They also talked about a sort of like a coalition against the right-wing extremism. Of course, they are meaning Trump in US and Bolsonaro in Brazil. But again, I mean, we know, I mean, Lula mentioned about fake news, the problem with fake news in Brazil, and Biden made some sort of joke, oh, this sounds familiar like US, but I mean, we know that US is the biggest producer of fake news. It's not about Trump. This is about how deep state of the United States works. So, and finally, there was two things that Lula mentioned, even before he went to US, he was still in Brazil, he mentioned that he was going to talk to Biden to request the lift of the embargo against Cuba, which lasts more than 60 years already. And also he would discuss the situation of Venezuela. But we don't know because maybe they had these discussions behind the scenes. There was no like any public statement about that. So let's wait and see. But I would say that was not like a real there was no like big announcements, as I said. So I think it was more of like a diplomatic sort of visit that Lula has to do. But actually, we're much more excited about the trip to Beijing, which Lula announced for the second half of March. And I'm assuming that in that case, we're going to see many more concrete agreements that will be good for both sides.
Right, Marco. Marco, there's also the overarching context of the war in Ukraine. Now, the United States and Brazil do not have similar positions on that. Is Lula going to try and push for peace?
Yeah, I would say that was also something happened in the discussions, because for the first time, actually, Lula was more critical of Russia. He actually criticized the fact that Russia sort of, quote unquote, invaded Ukraine, which is, I think, it's not the first time that some Brazilian official mentions that, but that was a joint statement with U.S. I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I'm a little bit worried about what's going to be Russia's response to that. But let's see. Anyway, Lula was very assertive about the peace negotiations. So even like he gave an interview to CNN to Christiane Amanpour, and she was like criticizing him and calling him out, say, "Oh, you didn't provide munitions or tanks to Ukraine as German had requested." He said, "No, of course not. I don't want to make war. I want to stop the war." And he repeated this twice. So he was very assertive and bringing again this idea of creating a group of countries that are not involved in the war directly, that could be a forum to negotiate the peaceful solution to the conflict.
Right, and we can't forget Bolsonaro, who is in the United States. I read a news report which said after Carnival he'll be back and so on. But is it very clear how strong the push for his extradition is going to be? What the U.S. is thinking about doing with him?
Well, that's a good question because U.S. is not going to do anything unless, of course, Brazil requests. And at this point, Brazilian government didn't request any extradition because there's a lot of investigations going on. Actually, Bolsonaro is guilty of a list of crimes. And probably in the next couple of months, there's maybe some of these investigations will lead to some sort of indictment or something like that. So let's see. At this point, also, it's not clear if Bolsonaro is coming back or not. He just renewed his passport, his visa for 6 months. He's telling his sons that he's not coming back, but at the same time, other sources say, "Oh, he might come back," as you said, after Carnival. So I think it's still a question mark. So let's see what's going to be the next chapters. But anyway, Bolsonaro, I think he will face very serious legal causes in Brazil because of so many crimes he committed.
Right, Marco. Thank you very much for joining us. Japan and the Philippines have moved several steps forward in efforts to deepen their defense ties. Japan said after a recent bilateral dialogue that they are moving closer because of complex international situations. Much of what they agreed on has a military dimension, more joint exercises, for instance, but also a disaster relief plan with a possible military angle. Anish from People's Dispatch joins us for more on the context and possible outcomes. Anish, thanks for joining us. Anish, can you just give us whatever details we know from the Philippines and Japan's recent discussions? And also, to what extent is what they're agreeing on, what they seem to be agreeing on, reflective of Manila's concerns about China?
Yeah, so right now, President Marcos Jr. is in Japan. He and other officials of his government has been in discussions with their Japanese counterparts on various issues, and they have signed so far about 7 agreements, ranging from disaster relief to agriculture. Some of the main focus has been definitely of all this has been to increase defense relations between the two countries, and the disaster relief agreement that they have, which is basically going to give which is going to pave way for joint military drills on that front between the two countries, and so that will also give way to more robust discussion, as they say, or a more comprehensive discussion between the two militaries on creating like a sort of joint military agreement or a defense agreement in the near future, which can be problematic. Now, obviously, Philippines and Japan are neighbors, so it is not uncommon for them to hold meetings, hold talks, sign deals and agreements. But when the whole thing turns to, when the focus very roundly stays around defense and military, or creating a military agreement, with the speaker himself talking about how Philippines is looking for a sort of VFA agreement, which is a visiting forces agreement that they have with the United States, a similar kind of agreement with Japan, already making statements about that. We are seeing a sort of more closer military link that Philippines is trying to push for with not just Japan, but also the US and its allies in the region, tilting the balance sort of thing, and also pushing for maybe a more partisan approach vis-a-vis China and the US. And currently, as we talk, with the tensions being so high, these kind of talks obviously indicate towards a certain inclination that can be problematic in the near future. So obviously, Philippines has its own dispute with China in the South China Sea. With it being a multilateral dispute, there is obviously going to be tensions around that. There were tensions recently with fishing boats and patrol boats with each country talking about the other going into their territory or the territory that they have claimed. Under the Marcos government right now, there hasn't been any attempt so far, as we can see, or any serious attempt so far to actually hold any serious talks to resolve some of these, or at least create a mechanism whereby they can actually have a workable solution around it so that trade and other sort of relations can continue even when a territorial dispute is ongoing. We have also seen certain court orders recently that actually struck down certain joint ventures in the South China Sea that could have helped in easing tensions, but now that is going to be more difficult. So these factors are definitely going to affect how Philippines is going to. And we also have to mention that in the previous Duterte administration, the approach when it came to China and the United States was quite different. And so this is a very stark shift where the current government is, although continuing a lot of domestic policies of the previous government, is trying to shift away from a more neutral or a more practical position to a more pro-US position in the region right now.
Right, Anish. Anish, does it actually signal even greater influence or role for the United States in the region?
It is too soon to say right now, because obviously a country like Philippines, with the history that the sort of history that it has had, it has always been a sort of one of the third world country allies that the US could always count on
Right.
as being a friendly nation, if not a proper military ally, but in a post Cold War world order. So in that sense, obviously, it is too soon to say how much expansion the US is trying, expansion of US influence we are seeing right now. But obviously, there is a very clear tilt by the current government to push towards a pro-US stand, a pro-Japan stand, and maybe a more. It's not very clearly anti-China, but obviously they are targeting. They're not naming China, but they're targeting China with the sort of deals and the sort of talks that they are continuing right now. So this definitely shows a certain, uh, uh, you know, a diversion from an earlier position, a more pragmatic position of keeping military alliances at bay, but having robust trade and diplomatic relations with both sides, and keeping yourself out of any kind of tensions and any kind of conflict. Now, whether or not Philippines wants to drag itself into a conflict is a different question. At this point, it's not very clear, but obviously when it's trying to create such it is already expanding. We have reported about this in the show itself. It is already expanding US military footprint in its own country by giving the VFA or other sort of access to US military to set up bases, even though temporary, but set up bases and training camps in the Philippines, in its armed forces bases in very strategic locations that are strategic for the US more than it is for the Philippines. So in that context, we are looking at how, and also when we look at how Japan is now trying to go a very hard turn towards an anti-China position in its foreign policy right now under the Kishida government. And then we have the talk of a VFA sort of agreement that the Philippines already gave up on with the United States. And now it's talking about actually allowing Japanese forces to have bases in the Philippines, proper bases in the Philippines. It's going to be a very disconcerting position for anybody who advocates for peace and stability in the region. You have to remember that this region in general has not seen as much conflict as the rest of the world has in the past several decades now. And creation of new flashpoints are always going to be a matter of concern for anybody who's observing the situation right now.
Right, Anish, thanks a lot for joining us with that update. And we'll ask you to just hang on for another minute. We'll be back with you. So before we close for this week, Anish has another update for us on China's weather balloon. Let's go back to him. So Anish, one would have thought there was enough hot air about the balloon coming from the west, but it seems you have an update for us. What's the latest on the balloon?
Well, a couple of latest updates actually, because the United States has ever since it shot down the balloon that it calls as a spy balloon, it has actually created more ruckus since then, rather than letting it, resolve itself. We already have a congressional resolution which has been almost nearly unanimously passed with no against vote, condemning China's incursion or Chinese balloons, invading the United States. And we also have the United States right now sanctioning several, tech companies, aeronautical companies that may have association with the Chinese military, stating that it wants to discourage any kind of aeronautical advancements, especially in the high altitude balloon technology that China is apparently creating for surveillance around the world. We have already seen this past week that the United States is talking to ambassadors around the world. It has briefed about 40 ambassadors about how Chinese balloons have apparently invaded their countries, probably in the past few years, and that these balloons are there for surveillance. Now, we have talked about this in our articles on the website about how there is still no clear evidence that the balloon, the high altitude balloon that maneuvered itself into the U.S. airspace and the Canadian airspace, was actually a surveillance balloon to begin with, or has any kind of surveillance capabilities. The U.S. is using the presence of solar panels as an evidence that it was being used for espionage. But again, the technology is way too far off. We are talking about a very conspicuous balloon.
Right.
If you're looking at US media's terminologies, it is the size of 3 school buses. So obviously, it's a very high, large balloon that is that can be obviously seen by even the naked eye, let alone, and can be reported very easily by even the local media channels with their cameras. So this is definitely not some kind of a very advanced espionage if you're looking at one. Not to mention that China's claims have more substantial plausibility. If you look at how high altitude weather balloons have often just crossed borders all the time because
right.
of unforeseen weather conditions. And the airflow, what US is trying to say is that the airflow of the balloon does not match, the flow of the balloon and the airflow at the time did not match. And so this is definitely something that had its own set of control, or was being controlled from Beijing. But then there are actual meteorologists in the United States that are saying that it is it is least likely that this balloon can be controlled in such a large range, which is about thousands of miles away from mainland China. So this sort of whole situation right now, which has blown up, and we have already seen talks about another unmanned ship being shot down over Alaska, and lasers apparently being seen in Hawaii, which now Japan is also pitching in as saying to be from China somehow. But obviously, this has created a sort of paranoia that is not warranted in many ways, because it could have been resolved very easily only if US officials had shown a certain level of professionalism and diplomacy in how they wanted to treat it. China has repeatedly stated that it has kept conveying to the United States that this is a civilian balloon. It could have been captured easily. It was a very slow moving balloon. It took days to traverse through the United States. And it, just because it flew over a nuclear site, a military controlled nuclear plant, it was deemed as an espionage balloon when it really just didn't go through any kind of strategic locations in the country either. So this is something that was obviously overblown, and it has gone on for so long. It's almost been a week since the balloon was shot down, but we still keep hearing about it. We still have the U.S. trying to insist that it is a espionage balloon, but without giving clear evidence to show it. It is yet to make any kind of evidence about it being an espionage balloon or surveillance craft to any other country, even when it is briefing these nations currently. So we have to be very careful how something that is supposed to be so irrelevant in the grander scheme of things is now one of the biggest flashpoints and the biggest escalation of tensions between the two countries, and we're counting even the trade wars under the Trump administration. So this is obviously this is this statement that China has invaded the United States. It's a serious one, and it will be taken far more seriously. And we are seeing almost nearly bipartisan support to these claims right now in the United States. And that is more concerning right now because the contribution to the tensions between the two countries is unimaginably high, and the manner in which it is being extended, it only shows that this is going to keep haunting us for the next couple of weeks at least.
Right, Anish, and thanks a lot for joining us. And that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us on Monday. You can find more such stories on our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and our regular updates are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.